Welcome. This is Darryl Robert Schoon with Dollars and Cents, and I'm going to continue where I left off on my last program, where I was going to discuss certain personalities that may or may not be familiar with you. And on my last program, I discussed the gentleman John Exter, who was a central banker, graduated during the Depression from Harvard University, and saw the huge outflow of gold happen on his watch while he was with the New York Federal Reserve. Exter became convinced that the United States, unless it did something radically different, and he never gave it much chance that it was going to, and it certainly hasn't, was headed for another deflationary collapse on the level of the Great Depression of the 1930s. There was a story about Exter that I would like to bring up now. Exter has a special part in my heart because he was a man who spoke the truth and he stayed true to it. And compared to the other three people that I'm going to talk about, I guess they stayed true to themselves because we all play different roles on the stage of life, and I guess it's certainly not up to me to judge it, though I have. I'm trying to stop that habit. But John Exter, I think it was during the 1970s, he had an office, I don't know where it was, but down the hall from a very famous economist, Paul Samuelson. And they would argue. Samuelson was a paper boy, banker, all right, believed in the system. And Exter didn't. And it's really sort of tragic the way the discussion ended. Because what happened was that Samuelson listened to everything Exter had to say. And at the end he said this. This was his cheap, crappy, low retort. Well, John, you may be right. But if you are, you're lonely. Which meant nobody believed him. And he was just stating the truth. I don't think Samuelson was trying to be catty. He was stating the truth. All bankers believe like he did in the world of paper, debt-based money, and central banking. And John Exter alone did not. And so if John is here today, around us, watching in, I'd just like to say thank you, John, on behalf of the many of us who have found your truth and your character to be of exemplary quality in these dark days that we're now transiting. In contradistinction to the life of John Exter, I would like to go over the illustrious career of Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker joined the staff of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York as an economist. In 1957, as an economist, he joined Chase Manhattan Bank. In 1962, he moved over to the U.S. Treasury as Director of Financial Analysis. In 1963, he was Undersecretary of Monetary Affairs at Treasury. In 1965, he returned to the private sector as Vice President at Chase Manhattan Bank and Director of Planning. Chase Manhattan Bank, if many of you don't know, is the Rockefeller Bank. All right? From 1969 to 1974, he was Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Monetary Affairs. Volcker, quote, played an important role in the decisions leading to the U.S. suspension of gold convertibility in 1971, which resulted in the collapse of the international monetary system that had put together at Bretton Woods after World War II. In 1975, he became president of the New York Federal Reserve, and from there he was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve by President Jimmy Carter, whereupon he raised prime interest rates to 21.5% to successfully bring down inflation. In 1983, Volcker was reappointed to be as Fed chairman by Ronald Reagan. In 1987, he was fired by Reagan for not being a strong enough deregulator. This was the period when the Reagan administration was unleashing the fetters of, quote, free enterprise in America. All right? He was, in 1987, he moved over once again to the private sector, where he was chairman of J. Rothschild Wolfenson, a New York corporate and investment advisory firm. And currently, Paul Volcker is an advisor to the current president, Barack Obama. Now, I know that most of you out there are either aligned with the Democratic or Republican parties. It's like going to a titty bar, and each has their own favorite. All right? Ronald Reagan was a great pole dancer for those on the right. He said all the right things, and they loved him, tipped him well. All right? He was elected on a program of balancing the budget. He left office where he had basically taken the U.S. deficit from under $1 trillion after 200 years to almost $4 trillion, and Americans loved him. That's why they lie to you. That's why politicians lie to Americans. They get away with it. And you eat it up like a lapdog eating slud off the street. All right? Bill Clinton was elected in 1992. All right? American. Oh, the left, the liberals. All right? This man came in and brought NAFTA with him, which gutted, which started the exodus of jobs from the United States with NAFTA. All right? And when Bill Clinton left office 8 years later, he had, with his pressure, allowed China into the World Trade Organization, and there went the rest of the jobs. And just as the Republicans loved old Ronnie Reagan, the Democrats loved Bill Clinton. Suck it up, America. This didn't happen by accident. This is all part and parcel of what has happened to this country. Now, on the other side, during this, behind the political scenes, you have the Federal Reserve Bank, all right? This is the central banking mechanism in America. This is the monster responsible for our present situation, all right? And very few people know this. People are looking to Bernanke to save them. This is the man who helped send this country into the trouble that it's in, all right? Now, so we go back to Volcker, Paul Volcker. He was indicative of these people that move between Wall Street and the government, all right? And I'll tell you, compared to Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan, Paul Volcker really is a man of integrity, relatively speaking. All right? I want to move over to a person who I'm sure all of you are familiar with, Alan Greenspan. All right? This was the darling of Wall Street. This was the darling of Americans. He presided over the greatest run-up, the greatest speculative bubble since the 1920s. And Americans didn't think this was a bubble. They thought it was the expanding U.S. economy. But if you look at the move of the Dow from a low of 777 in 1982 to where it blew up at 11,400 in 2000, it was a bubble because the American economy only expanded a few percentage points during this time. But the stock market exploded in value. I think it increased around 1,700% over 18 years. The greatest bull market in the history of capitalism. Well, what it was the greatest bubble in the history of capitalism. But all of you who are watching, who were there, who saw your portfolios expand, you didn't think it was a bubble. You thought, my God, I'm here at the right time. I'm making all this money. Just like those who had houses during this time, 10 years later thought, man, I'm the luckiest person on the block. I haven't even repainted my house. And I bought it at $160,000 and I could sell it tomorrow at $240,000. You know, maybe I will sell it and buy a $500,000 house. And that'll go up to $1 million. Man, I am one smart investor. Well, maybe you were, maybe you weren't. But what we had was Alan Greenspan, all right? Alan Greenspan was, when we talked about in the last program, we said that Paul Volcker had been fired by President Reagan in 1987 because he wouldn't deregulate the economy at the level that he wanted. Who he put in to replace Volcker was Alan Greenspan, an acolyte of Ayn Rand, the school that all government control is bad, and then you could put your faith in the private marketplace. You could put your faith in man's inherent desire to expand. That if you let loose the entrepreneurial spirit of the used car salesman and the banker on Wall Street, this world would be a far better place in which to live in. That government itself was the governor on the pot of gold. Replace the governor, take off the lid, you're going to have the world that you want. This was Ayn Rand. And Alan Greenspan, bless his nebbish little heart, believed her 100%. When Ayn Rand died, he was there at the funeral. They had a wreath in the form of a dollar bill. This is what these people worship. Selfishness. Now, Ayn Rand wasn't all bad. She knew about money. She knew about gold. And she knew that the debasement of the U.S. currency was not a good thing. And so did Alan Greenspan, her acolyte. He wrote a paper on gold. And he said later on in testimony to the United States Congress that only gold will hold its value. All right? But he presided over the great debasement of the U.S. dollar. Why? Because Alan Greenspan was an ambitious man, like Brutus. And where Brutus would kill Caesar, Alan Greenspan would be responsible pretty much for the death of the U.S. dollar. For though the death of the U.S. dollar is not going to happen on his watch, he was the one who did and set in motion all those policies that would lead to its later demise. Alan Greenspan was appointed by Ronald Reagan to replace Paul Volcker in 1987. And he's got a nickname later. It's not Sir Alan Greenspan. He was knighted. Most of you don't know this. He was given the Order of KBE by Queen Elizabeth because he had presided over the greatest expansion of the stock market in the history of the world. They saw this man as, just like they saw Volcker as a savior of the U.S. economy, they saw Greenspan as the knight who resurrected a moribund and dying economy and turned it around into the extraordinary economic expansion that we witnessed during the 80s and 90s. What they didn't realize, Greenspan had done this by borrowing the savings of Japan and Germany, turning the United States into a debtor nation, and keeping a heavy foot on the gas pedal. That's what he did. Every time the United States economy started contracting, Alan let loose. He did it little on and little off, but where he should have tightened, he did tighten, but not enough. Now, I want to tell you something about Alan Greenspan. When he was finally hauled before Congress, Alan, very, very much a manipulator. He was really good because he was smarter than most of the people he was talking to. He knew those people were ignorant. You know, you call them senator and congressman, but most of them were very ignorant of the things that he was talking about. He was truly the Wizard of Oz. And so they'd ask him these questions, and he'd answer in Greenspan speak. He'd answer in words that they couldn't understand. And they didn't have the balls to ask him what the hell he was talking about because it showed that they were ignorant. All right? So Greenspan got away with this charade for years. Now, in 1994, Greenspan began getting worried. All right? He knew exactly what was going on. Now, 10 years later, Greenspan would have the temerity to stand up and testify, well, you know, it's very hard to tell when a bubble is developing. That's what he said about the bubbles that happened on his watch. The 2000 tech bubble and the later property bubble that he fostered. All right? His defense was, well, you know, it's very, very difficult to tell when a bubble is happening. All right? And people bought it. Why? Because it was what Alan Greenspan said. I mean, he's telling the truth, isn't he? I mean, he knows more than anybody else. I want to take you back to 1994. Alan Greenspan saw a bubble developing. All right? That stock market was growing far faster than the economy, which meant to him that a bubble was happening. And what is a bubble? A bubble is a leveraged credit explosion that ends badly. All right? And if you nip it soon enough, you can stop it from the bad ending. It's like smoking cigarettes. If you stop at 3 cigarettes a day instead of 3 packs a day, the chances of you not developing lung cancer are far greater. So let's go back to 1994. Greenspan saw a bubble developing. And he wrote, and it's in the public record, though you don't know it, I think we have nipped the bubble in the bud. He said, congratulating himself for their Fed perspicacity to recognize a bubble in its infancy, that the stock market was beginning to gather strength and head for the hills, all right, or the sky, where it would explode in spectacular fashion as it did in 1929. So Greenspan said, in a self-congratulatory manner, he wrote, I think we have nipped the bubble in the bud. What happened is, he looked at that bubble 2 years later, and it hadn't been nipped in the bud. It was growing, all right? In 1996, it was growing. Now, if you look at the growth of the Dow. It didn't take off until 97. That's when the thing started going like this. But in 1994, he knew it was building. In 1996, he knew the interest rates he had raised in 94 didn't do the job. This is the same damn excuse that Paul Volcker gave to John Exter. Exter said, what can I do? Exter said, raise the interest rates. And Volcker said, what else can I do? Well, you can shut the gold window because it's going to all go to hell if you don't do that. And Volcker took the easy way out. He shut the gold window and took the cotter pin out of the international monetary system. All right? Well, Greenspan, here he's watching this thing, all right? And it's building. It's building. It looks like that we may have trouble here. So what Greenspan does, he goes before the Congress and he warns them because he knows it's a political decision. Everybody talks about the Fed as being independent. It is not independent. You don't get there unless you're a toady to the powers that be. You don't get appointed to do what needs to be done unless the people who own the system think you're man enough for the job. Or not man enough, a wuss enough, a minion enough, a toady to power who will do the right thing. And this is exactly what Alan Greenspan did. And that's why he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth for so doing, to laying down on the job with what he knew to be wrong. In October of 1996, what he did was he mentioned before the Congress that there was pressures building. All right? He, in typical Greenspan obfuscation speak, he warned that there were things happening in the market that would force the Fed to take unusual actions. All right? He said this, hoping that maybe the rest of the system would respond to the warning of Alan Greenspan. It didn't. The boys in Wall Street already smelled blood, and they knew it was going in their direction. So, 4 months later, in March of 2007, Greenspan decided to dispense with the Greenspan oblique speak. And he came out and said in testimony to Congress, I am going to raise interest rates if this does not halt. All right? Well, what happened was this. 2 months later, Greenspan issued a statement saying, it is not the policy of the Federal Reserve to prick bubbles with monetary means. And then Wall Street knew it was off to the races. The cheap money that Alan Greenspan presided over was going to increase. Now, who was president during this time? Easy Bill Clinton. Friend of Goldman Sachs. The man who came into office, sold out the union working class, sending jobs first to South America, and finished it off in a coup de grace, like a bullet to the back of the head when he let China in to the World Trade Organization, and the real exodus of jobs happened. That's who was there. And he let it happen. In 1999, a coalition of U.S. financial interests pushed through the repeal of Glass-Steagall on Bill Clinton's watch, and that really was, it spelled the end. Glass-Steagall was enacted in 1933 to prevent another Great Depression. It basically said something very simply, that it never again were they going to allow investment banks to bet the savings of commercial banks on the roulette wheel of Wall Street. In 1933, they passed that. We didn't have a depression. And since then, in 1999, they signed the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And 6 years later, 7 years later, we had a calamitous collapse of the world financial system. Now, you've heard a lot about the financial reform that has happened, that Barack Obama tried to put through in Congress. All right? You heard Wall Street bitching. You heard people saying, Dodd-Frank, we've plugged the holes. I want to tell you something. That gate that they opened with Glass-Steagall is still there. Wall Street still can bet your dollars and take the cream of the profits that they win and leave you with the losses if you lose. That's what's happened. That's what we've got. So that's what Alan Greenspan did. He stayed at the Fed after the collapse in 2000 of the stock market bubble that he saw happening. He had to raise interest rates, and he finally did. Brought down and popped the bubble because he was forced to. Now there were going to be massive losses. All right? The stock market started to crash. It started collapsing. So in 2002, he slashed interest rates from 5.25% down to 1%, starting the property bubble. He presided over the securitization of debt that allowed debt to be sold on a worldwide basis. All right? Greenspan later said, he said, well, you know, in a mea culpa, I had faith in the system. I had faith that Wall Street would not do something like this. Well, Alan Greenspan was a bit disingenuous when he said those words. He was self-serving to the end because he knew what the consequences were going to be. And if Alan Greenspan and Bill Clinton deserve any extra opprobrium for what has happened to this country, it's only because they were smart enough to know the difference. I want to tell you something about George Bush Jr. The man was as stupid as a rock, and he didn't know what was going to happen. He did what he was told to do, and he did it well. He served power well, not knowing what the consequences were, but he didn't care. He was born to money, and he served money. Bill Clinton and Alan Greenspan were not born to money. They served money, and they served power, and they served this country up on a platter on which is now filled with blood because of what they have done. This is really what I'm talking about. Those who know and those who don't know. Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. He grasped power. He grasped what was at stake. But when he was at George Washington University, his mentor was Carroll Quigley, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. These are the power boys. And Quigley wrote a book talking about the intent of one world dominion by the bankers. And Quigley said, it's a good thing. These people know what they're doing. Well, Bill Clinton was a student in Quigley's class, and he thought, I don't know if it's a good thing, but if I'm going to get elected president, I got to be on their side. And he did so. That's how he got there. That's how both Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton were chosen to lead their respective parties, because they could do the dance. They could attract the votes, and the people who owned them could do what they wanted to do. This is what representative democracy has come to be. Democracy does not represent you, it represents them. You merely give them the wherewithal to do so when you go in that voting booth and pull that lever or punch that hole. You think this is better than a titty bar or a 25-cent porno ring at your local video slut shop? No. Each one is getting off. Each one is thinking they're getting something from it. It's pretty late in the game, unfortunately. But I think history has put us here for a reason. The truth of the matter is, neither Bill Clinton nor Alan Greenspan could have stood up to them. I think the last person who did stand up to them, John F. Kennedy, was shot. And that's really how power works. All right? You stand up to the boys in power, you're shot. It's as simple as that. Because to them, you broke an oath. They own the presidency. They own the government. They own the country. And if you have the temerity to stand up in their house, they will cut you down like they did the Kennedys. These are very, very ruthless people because the payoff is so huge. Clinton could have chosen not to have done the bidding of the powerful, but I can assure you he would not have been President of the United States for 2 terms. And Alan Greenspan would not have been chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006. It's 2011, folks. Wake up and smell the napalm.